Invite Professor Sheila Jasanoff to join us. She's joining us from Kennedy School of Government and Harvard Kennedy School. And to set it off, Sheila, I mean, in your talk, you spoke to how, for instance, as a student of science and technology and society, you had thought deeply about resilience far before, I mean, much before some of the ideas which we are now engaging with even were formulated in terminology and shaped into some sort of political styles. And I'm quoting about the current times. You said, I'm a student of science, technology, and society, and I put into my thoughts about resilience both the possibilities of technology, that I can be in Canada, India, and the US on the same day, hours apart, and the downside of technology, that the version of me is capable of being transported, is a very pixelated, reduced, shallow, thin version, and the version of you that comes back to me is equally thinned out. Some of you I know from before, and therefore when you come to me digitally, you know you are still three-dimensional in some sense, but not everybody. So how does one think about inclusivity in this sort of era? And you went on to say, in a way, Zoom has imposed a kind of inclusivity. So I extract this quote because it speaks to me a certain sense of what is happening to all of us. And you actually said it in the first lecture. And as we move through, we are getting more and more zoomed out of being able to interact with each other in real ways. So how do you see this shaping up as we move forward through this time?
Well, Leo, first of all, I'd like to thank you and Bhargavi for having had this idea and executing it in this remarkable way, and for bringing us all together for this last session. So that in itself is an illustration of a positive imaginary, and also a kind of use of the medium that when you went through rehearsing where everybody is coming from, this is itself a kind of achievement that one shouldn't lose sight of. And so one of the big developments in the last few weeks in my sort of life, because I'm at a university, is that universities have been going through this decision about how to run our instruction in the fall semester. And the question you ask about being zoomed out or whatever is extremely centrally in our minds right now, because most of our universities in the US, most research universities have decided to hold their courses online for the first semester. And one of the consequences of this is that we will be teaching in the fall semester to students whom we have never met in person. We won't have a chance to have them come into our offices, and we will have a bunch of strangers confronting us on these screen loads. And obviously it's a far from ideal kind of situation. But the way in which this is impinging on the lives of US academics at the moment is not just the technology, but the interpenetration of the technology and the ways in which it's ordering our lives with the ways in which people are using their power to aggravate the situation or not. So I'm sure many of you know that in the last 72 or so hours in the US, one thing that has happened is that the immigration authorities have issued a directive that international students must go back home if all of their classes are going to be online. And the rational argument is that why do they need to be in the US if their instructions are not going to involve in-person meetings at all. Now, everybody knows that this directive is aimed at several different policy objectives that the present US administration stands behind, and I won't bother to rehearse them. But I think that the point to make clear is that it's not just the technological possibilities sitting there, it's how people use and apply their institutional powers, how they amplify and aggravate them or extend them and make them more beneficial. That is the situation that we're having to confront. So my university has joined together with MIT to bring a lawsuit against this directive, and we'll be seeing in the next week really how that is going to unfold. At ESG, of course, you have enormous experience using public interest litigation and the power of legal systems to again bring to the forefront the unjust dimensions of the ways in which people are using knowledge and power to put their ideas and their policies across. We will have to see how this works out in practice. In America at the moment, the question of positive imaginaries and resilience, these things, I'm sure my other colleagues from the US will be speaking to this and from their different angles. It's a little bit difficult to focus on the positive when there's a national election looming, and that is going to result in somebody winning and somebody losing. And I can tell you that there's a lot of energy focused on the question of who is going to be doing the losing. While you're focusing on who's going to be doing the losing, the question of looking beyond that day and having the positive imagination of what's going to come afterwards is a little bit more difficult than one might imagine. So I think that people of goodwill at the moment in my communities that I'm involved in are trying to get beyond the winning and the losing day in November and thinking ahead to what might lie beyond it. One of the things that I hope does not lie beyond it is the positive dimensions of globalization that we have been able to see in the last 30 to 40 years. So I think that there's a danger that there will be an overreaction and a kind of narrowing of the parochial visions without, as part of the kinds of phenomena that I'm sure Michael will talk about again, and that he already talked about, is the tethering of the runaway horses of globalization, something that we should be applauding or that we should be a little worried about as well. And again, being in the educational world, which depends on a free-flowing exchange of ideas and people and the possibility of speaking with and training movements of ideas that build across communities, I think that I'm a little bit worried about the risks of pulling back from that. I will end though by saying that I myself have no intention of pulling back from using both the burdens of the moment, that is, we cannot get together, and yet the advantages of the moment, that is, that we can get together, to form and strengthen new kinds of alliances. And the comparative project that you and Bhargavi and I are engaged in is an example of opportunities that nevertheless are arising to try to put our experiences together on the same page and go back to these very foundational questions of what a social movement's going to be about, what positive futures can we collectively project. And so for myself, I'm going to be taking every possible opportunity to keep on trying to build those alliances across countries and across sectors. And I'm deeply thankful to have the kinds of people in this conversation that are here this morning and to have you and Bhargavi as among the groups of people who will energize these contacts and conversations for the slightly more passive personalities that we sit-at-home academics tend to be. So thank you again.
I just have a follow-up in a sense, because in your talk when you gave it, you actually spoke of how the world is too densely interconnected. And just now, as you said, how the state is trying to tear away students, especially because of their notion of what online classes are, and how those students are not technically students and therefore they must leave. But you also said in your talk that we live in a world with tightly coupled systems. And you also asked whether that can be sustained. Now, the last 2 months, as we have gone through this series of talks, at least where we are now, after going through these highly centralized notions of governing societies and people and large populations that India did, we now have a very deep awareness in Karnataka, where they found that it has to be extremely localized. So suddenly they're talking about localizing it when the pandemic has hit the roof, literally. So how do you see going forward unknotting the tightly coupled systems which have been so problematic in the world?
Thanks for the question, Leo. So the idea of tight coupling, I associate with the work of Charles Perrow back in the 1980s, when he was talking about technological systems in you can't prevent runaway accidents, because once you set the cascade going, it just keeps on going for, until a disastrous meltdown or breakdown of some sort happens. And the classic examples, of course, are Chernobyl and then later on Fukushima. So I think in the context of a large technological system, this question of whether there are feedback loops, whether there are stopping points, what happens when the core system gets overwhelmed, those kinds of questions are always in one's mind with a tight coupling. But in the days of social media, we see another kind of tight coupling, which is that ideas can become runaway ideas. And I would love to hear from some of my colleagues about what they think of those kinds of problems that you said. It's not obvious that something that works well at the local level and in terms of local debate, if it's amplified into a movement where nobody's actually thinking about it, that it has hugely positive repercussions as the scale gets amplified. So that is something that I worry about. But the other dimension is the centralization. I mean, so I think it's not just the tight coupling, it's the idea that there is a particular policy wisdom or capacity to act located in one place, whether it's DC or whether it's New Delhi, and that therefore the entire system should move as an organism in response to those ideas. I think that the pandemic has demonstrated the falsity of that notion. And I think that there is going to be an enormous amount to learn from the varieties of federalism, the varieties of subsidiarity that have manifested themselves. So, it's interesting to me that the Kerala model, after having been silent for a little while, has suddenly come roaring back in the context of this epidemic. And people are saying things like, well, why did Kerala succeed in certain ways better than, for instance, the capital region has in India? And similarly, there are questions here about the lockstep developments in the south of America that seem to be now suffering from the consequences, as compared with something like the region in which I live, in which a different set of local institutions have managed to do things. So it's not just whether it's decentralized or not, it's also the nature of these couplings. I'm not able to say anything definitive at the moment. I think that the whole principle of subsidiarity, the whole principle of federalism, these were built on the notion that there are some governmental capabilities and some collective mobilization capabilities that simply do not work well if you centralize them. And I think that we're going to have a lot more information and a lot more analytic purchase on the question of what kinds of connections between center and periphery or center and locality work or don't work. I've always been a proponent of bottom-up sorts of institution building, and it's what I've done in building my institutions in academia as well. I see no reason to retreat from the idea that strong institutional fabrics at the local level are a good place or a better place to start than the pretense that the center knows exactly how to deal with the far-flung reaches of its empire. That, I think, is going to stand as a kind of insight that we all share.
Thank you very much, Sheila. I will now pass on to Bhargavi to invite Michael, but before that, I want to say that our friend Nilufar Koch has not been well, and we wish her the best. I'm just going to read out a couple of lines from her talk to give you a sense of what she spoke to. She explained to us the situation in Rojava, where people have reorganized themselves and built a bottom-up, like you said, Sheila, society and governance systems without a constitution through the wall, and through one side battling ISIS, another side battling the entire geopolitical forces which basically descended on northern Syria, northern eastern Syria. She said that society has their ethical norms, speaking of Kurdish society, that are older than the law. So in the Kurdish society and also in the Arabic society, as well as Christian societies, there is an ethical consciousness that they find very important. If someone is doing wrong in our society, then the highest punishment is social isolation. You don't put men or women who are involved in some crisis in that society in leading positions of governance, but you basically test them against certain ethical norms. Then she said, we are forced to think about smart strategies, and our advantage is that we have great philosophers like Abdullah Öcalan, who has produced several books from his prison cell on the island of Imrali, and that he has prepared us to fight the curse of the new age. And speaking to the need to start changing our consciousness, she said, our history is our university. We learn from our pain and mistakes in the past. We are editing them all in northeast Syria. In the light of our tragic history, we have come to regard the people as subjects of politics. We don't just accuse others. We have to be more self-critical. It is easy to point fingers and expect the state or God to do things for you. So in that sense, she said, this inspired the model for the structure of the existing nation state as a people living in autonomy, living independently or independent of the centralized structure. Kurds still believe that we need a nation state, but it is not because they are nationalistic, but because it will facilitate better protection of people as they are hunted by other nation states. And she also spoke about Öcalan's idea of having a Kurdish identity across many nations or nation states. So that is Nilufar's talk in brief. Over to you, Bhargavi.
Thank you, Leo. So going over Michael Goldman's talk, Michael raised a whole lot of very important points. First of all, he started off saying, so who's dying? And he brought the attention to the health workers, the janitors, the doctors, the elderly, the young, and a disproportionate number of which are people of color. And he also brought focus how in some places 2/3 are African American and the new immigrants, even though they represent a relatively small fraction of the population. Then he also went on to show the participants about how every now and then, like even though the word resilience comes up all the time in the World Bank policy, it is busy incorporating the same corporate business model in its lending and support around the world. And this particularly is very important in the context of India, because World Bank has yet again come up with something more interesting with respect to data. Then Michael moved on to discuss even about the global food systems. Then he drew the example of Sainath's book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought, and spoke about how the pandemic is affecting the local communities. Then another important point I found in Michael's talk was he said, let us not forget that even before the pandemic, the United States was alive and well with protest movements pushing for structural change. And that was exactly what was happening in India as well, while now all those movements have, been put aside. Then Michael also spoke about activists, saying that activists are presenting the plan for housing cooperatives linked to nearby farmer collectives, producing food and community healthcare clinics, offering free services anchored by what are being called community schools, with educators realizing that education is a small fraction of what our public schools provide to the community. Some falling schools are being redesigned to offer not just a set of classes for kids, but also for support for these kids. And then there were a whole lot of other points that came out in his talk. For example, he spoke about intentional communities, cooperative movements, and connecting with local producers and craftspeople, cultivate these relational dynamics focused on producing and caring and giving and meeting people's needs. So I will stop there and maybe let Michael speak again, and then we could take a question or so. Over to Michael.
Wow. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Bhargavi. Well, a lot has changed since Sheila and I spoke at the beginning of this series, and in particular, the call from the streets, the locality, particularly where I live, Minneapolis, in what is being called the Minneapolis Uprising, is I can't breathe. And what I think is quite remarkable, vis-a-vis what Sheila was just speaking about, was how a seemingly local idiom, a local experience, a local, form of violence, police brutality against, in this case, the Black man, resonated around the world. And obviously, it resonated so deeply that now people are calling this the largest social movement in history. Black Lives Matter, which some of our panelists will speak to specifically, but it is quite remarkable that in a month where we were talking about social isolation, we're now talking about a global social movement. And I think we just need to think clearly about what happened. And although my talk was pretty much about looking at all the people, in a sense, dying from the pandemic and how it reflected the gross inequities in this business model, what we can call racial capitalism, or what I was just calling the role of finance capital in our global economy, we can see how it's so expressly articulated by people who are suffering under state or police brutality. That is, that the movements afoot and the calls for abolish not only harken back to 1492 and 1619 when slavery was introduced to the United States, but it's talking about something as practical and concrete as what Bhargavi was suggesting, is that our schools need to accommodate the needs of our community because the economy doesn't, right? And the abolish call is to stop mass incarceration, abolish the prison system. So it's not just abolish the brutality of, white cops, if you will, putting their knee on the necks of the lowest caste community in America, the Black population, but it's also absolutely clear. When you even when you walk on the streets of Minneapolis today, the murals painted on closed down shops across the city, and the streets that are emptied of cars and are now filled with people and bikes. These colorful murals are not just expression of frustration, but also of an imagination. They are talking about the end of consumer capitalism, and as expressed by the closing of all these shops, particularly the chains, and are talking about making anew communities. So bhargavi referred to what was considered an absolutely violent call by the Black Panthers in the 1970s, which was community schooling, which many of the principals, the heads of schools in this city, in Minneapolis, were saying once the schools were closed because of the pandemic, that you're not just stopping math and English from being taught in our schools. There is no pipeline for access to breakfast or lunch for 40% of the children in this city, right? There's no access to mental health care. There's no access to public space. There's no access to daycare for our parents. There's no access to mental health care for the parents of the children. So immediately teachers and principals, once the schools closed because of the pandemic, articulated during the George Floyd, if you will, movement, that schools are not just distribution of information. They are the anchor for communities. And if we want to rebuild, we stop with the privatization of our school system and we start with the community. But when we talk about the community, it's not like discrete, isolated, localized, poor people take care of poor people, rich people take care of rich people. Not at all. The philosophy and the discourse is highly radical, which is that 50% of the US economy right now, corporate profits, go to a tiny sector of the business world, which is Wall Street, finance capital. So 50% of the corporate profits go to a tiny strip of the economy. And the business model is to buy up whatever assets in society are sinking, such as our schools, our universities, or in the example I gave in my talk, healthcare systems and food systems, and allow them to run on a particular business model. So the reaction on the street level is that we want to abolish this kind of financialized system, which directly lays people off, which directly routes value away from communities and sends it to, if you will, Wall Street, the banking structure and the shadow banking structure, which is making so much money. If we look at the global pandemic and the doubling of the closing of the economy through the protests and the attempt to abolish the police system, is that the last 2 months, the last 3 months, Wall Street has made more money than it has in the last decade. So how is that possible? The economy, where 70% of the population is not working, is unemployed because of the pandemic and more, and because of the nature of the economy. There is a sector of the economy, which represents a huge percentage of the profits, are making absolute wealth. And if we drill down to how they're making that money, just one example, and I won't go beyond that, is that in this country in the last decade, 70% of our nursing homes, the places where elderly are placed in supposedly with 24-hour healthcare, 70% of our nursing homes are now owned by private equity firms. You recognize the names, Carlyle, KKR, Blackstone, which are also the largest landlords in India right now, right? Bought up huge sectors of your office space and your unfinished residential complexes and malls and such. And what do they do in the direct impact on the health and well-being of our elderly? They have cut out doctors, they have cut out nurses, and they have basically made something as simple as a 50-cent mask, N95 mask, which costs $0.50 in the market before the pandemic, are now, were for a long time unavailable, right? Our nurses and doctors were wearing plastic garbage bags, and our police were driving tanks with military equipment. So I'm not saying this from the ivory tower. I'm saying this from reading the language and the expression on the streets of Minneapolis. And what's so remarkable is that language is being translated around the world. So in terms of reimagination, you know, we don't have to go to the language of the World Bank, as you were suggesting, Bhargavi, which is resilience of the financialized economy, right? How can these companies continue to profit, even in a place like India or Indonesia? That's the question that the World Bank is trying to always answer. Instead, the politics of the street is to say, let's end this form of organizing society based on the needs of the economy, and instead organize based on our needs. So in terms of food, healthcare, schooling, all of which are not just being privatized, but are being owned by a segment of the business world with a business model which explicitly says, cut the labor force, cut the slack, as I said in my talk. And the slack in this case means healthcare provisions, which means intensive care units. So most of our hospitals, the intensive care unit is what's completely underfunded, right? And the hospitals owned by private equity firms made all its money through elective surgery, what rich people need when their shoulders or their backs or their knees go out. And so you could see what Isabel Wilkerson wrote about last week in the New York Times, a caste system. Everywhere we look, we see a caste system. In the United States, we call it racial capitalism. And I just want to end in terms of what Sheila talked about, runaway ideas. This is what reflects the vitality of the streets in Minneapolis today. Even though all the shops are boarded up, you have food pantries opened up, distributing for free food to anybody who needs it. We have on the streets medical care clinics because the hospitals are overloaded with coronavirus, and half our hospitals are actually closed, the elective surgery part. You have what Koch called in her talk about Kurdish movements, an anarchy, which is a critique of the state, because it's the state, according to people on the streets, that has its knee on their necks, such that they can't breathe. Because the state is just trying to reproduce this kind of unsustainable form of capitalism. And the articulation on the streets is that we need to create kind of a mutual aid societies, which have been popping up across our city, and I imagine elsewhere in the world, that have unambiguously articulated an alternative to this form of violent capitalism. So I just want to end by saying that the more we listen to, if you will, the protest movements, and realize that their runaway ideas have really gained traction around the world, for me, it's like an incredible spark of inspiration, because we don't need to read dense, terse books from history. That language is being expressed in the most revolutionary, but also common sense ways. The ideas that the Black Panthers had in the 1970s, for which they were shot on the street, are now becoming common sense in the Minneapolis City Council, in the Minneapolis school system, in the Minneapolis Park District. And so for me, in the midst of all the smoke and rubble, I think the way people are expressing things in Minneapolis and around the world gives me incredible amount of hope. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. Talking about schools, just a couple of days back, we had something crazy happening in India. So as part of reducing the syllabus, they have removed some very important topics in the syllabus of our CBSE schools for children, and that includes citizenship, federalism, secularism, partition, and all that. That was really crucial with our schools. But I would like to also go back to something that you had said, which is very important, and it kind of rings across all other lectures as well. So you had said, I think the idea of building local is really important, but the critique and the understanding that you have to work across communities is essential. And that's why I brought up the dangers of ethno-nationalism. You know, where we see caste and class and community and religion as borders, as obstacles, as enemies, when we are not going to survive climate crisis, we are not going to survive this pandemic, and we are not going to survive this economic crisis without realizing that we need to find solidarity amongst ourselves. So rather than the self-sufficient village, you call it a self-sufficient planet. So maybe with your thoughts on that, it will be good.
Okay. Well, in short, I mean, I think the idea of Black Lives Matter is not about a self-sustaining, isolated form of ethnicity. I think it's a critique of, since 1619 and the introduction of brutal slavery and genocide, that the idea of race or caste is completely relational or dialectic, right? By imposing oppression on one group of people, you're creating, if you will, democratic freedom amongst those that are creating the oppression. You're creating wealth by creating poverty. Through oppression, you're creating freedom. So I think the analysis behind the idea of Black Lives Matter is not about social isolation or a rebalancing of ethnic groups. It's about abolishing the system that created these kind of racial or caste-based divisions that created, if you will, this economic system and the state that supports it. So I think when the Kurds are talking about independence, they're not talking about independence of an isolated community. They're talking about a critique of the state and militarism and the embracing of a sustainable, if you will, a sustainable planet. The whole argument about climate change is that we all live on this fragile planet together, even though a small percentage of the population is actively destroying it, right? So the food system that produces $1 hamburger at the fast food joint in America is only produced because the fuel is completely subsidized by governments around the world and protected by subsidized militaries. Otherwise, there's no way we could get meat from China's slaughterhouses to produce our fast food, just like we have in the Midwest, our slaughterhouses producing pork for the Chinese market. And those are the people in those slaughterhouses that are being exposed, mostly people of color in the United States, who are being exposed to the virus. So you could see that the abolishing of ethno-nationalism, the abolishing of that relationality that creates an oppressor and an oppressed, wealth and poverty, is what these movements, the Kurdish movement, Black Lives Matter movements, are all about. It's not about ethno-nationalism. The people who critique it are basically wanting to create that retain that stratified system because of the benefits that it offers. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. I'll request Leo to brief us about Andrew Sterling's talk before we move on to the next one.
Bhargavi, I thought I'll come back to reading sections of Andrew and Prem Chandravarkar's talk later, because we have Odenda with us. He's from Kenya Land Alliance, and since Michael spoke of how the idea of organizing on solidarity lines based on the type of resource use that this world is created in such a very skewed manner, privileging the few, is effectively what Odenda also spoke about from his long experience working with many African countries, particularly in Kenya, especially with communities in Kenya. And to just read out, Odenda, your couple of things that you said. You spoke about community space and how that community space has been turned into a public space. And in that sense, the community becomes isolated within that public. And you also spoke of how, for instance, that had gone on with the state creating rangelands And those rangelands dissociated the pastoralists who created such community spaces and basically stratified it in such a way that those lands came under the control of the elites. And so that's where the extraction began, and that's how devastation of forests and rivers and commons, not just locally but regionally and across Africa, has been going on for centuries now. And you said that COVID is teaching us lessons that it is not enough to depend on the character of others. It is better that you plan for yourselves indoors in community land spaces. And it is high time they plan for themselves. In a sense, it was an argument against the state, because the state had repeatedly failed people across Africa. And here we are now looking at this pandemic in which the state has no idea. I mean, it's a state of utter helplessness. And you also said the state in that situation is foregoing public service and giving it to companies. And you concluded that it is a question of, that space has to be democratically controlled, not in terms of the democracy of numbers, but in the democracy of values. So I leave you with these thoughts from your talk, and would invite you to reflect now on how you feel about the same, considering things are...
Yeah, thanks, Leo, for that rekindling my mind about what I talked about in the first instance. I think in the last 3 months, I think that has been very, very key to me. And I think I still pick it from Michael's where he left it. This dialectical relational situations in the space of community has come out very interesting. We had been used that society is organized around the state and market agencies. And when the containment of COVID came in place, and we are being locked down in our own narrow, small spaces, social distancing, communities were basically wondering how this is going to work out, because some of the spaces that the community have enjoyed has, for all practical intents, always been managed as if it is a space for the community as well as for the state. And one of the most interesting thing about these spaces is that a lot of countries were trying to lock themselves within the sovereign spaces, when the reality of how communities go around utilizing resources defy that arrangement. And I would give you an instance, like in the East African region, the pastoralists within East Africa, they do to us humans across the borders, according to the need of the time. And when borders were being closed on all our fronts, they were like, how do you manage even that? And even the state itself was finding it even difficult, because in Kenya we are used to the situation where those borders were porous. Porous means the state mechanism was not fully at the borders. While we are trying to create those borders and create what we would call boundary struggles, we had many other struggles happening. So in one of those arrangements, when Kenya closed its borders with Tanzania, and yet they wanted the goods to come through, the Tanzanians were saying, we won't allow you to do that. But when that was happening, it so happened that a lot of our foodstuffs in Kenya were emanating from Tanzania. And that arrangement that Kenya was trying to do could not help. Equally, Uganda and Kenya, it was the same thing. But what even more was that when you had the trailers ferrying goods from Mombasa the whole way through Uganda, Rwanda, Congo DRC, Southern Sudan, and beyond, it so happened that because the drivers had not yet been certified to be free of COVID, were basically parking their trailers in spaces of community roadsides. It was not even just parking on the road reserves, but they were parking on the road reserves using the spaces of community. The community were like, what is this whole idea of containment when these guys are coming in our midst? And it was basically challenging the way we have arranged our society. It so happened that we were so interested to address the economic issues when the real essence we were supposed to address the health issues, which were equally concerning the communities. And when we heard just about 3 days ago or so, on 6th of this month, we opened up again the lockdown in Kenya. But when we are opening up, we are being again warned that the communities could not even seek medication in Nairobi, which had all the facilities that one would talk about, because they overstretched, and that everybody would be hospitalized in their own spaces. So the whole question about how we manage space was becoming very interesting. And in the same element, when it came to accessing natural resources of value, the government is still negotiating how to make concessions over community spaces. So I think what COVID has really brought to bear is that we need to re-evaluate the systems under which we have lived. When you put a division between economy and society, where draw you the line? Where does the society end and where does the economy start? And the communities are asking those questions. When you try to create a situation where the social reproduction and especially the care services, which you could even talk of as far as Mike was talking about the elderly being cared for, who are caring for the elderly. Majority of those who are coming from the quote unquote, the third world countries, seeking nursing opportunities in those places. You are now asking yourself, how are we going to draw those lines between the social reproduction services and the economic production services? And I think, to me, those start creating a lot of major questions. When people are being told that students, as our colleague has said, that the students should go back to their homes and not stay in America. After all, we are going to study online. Does that also stop essential migration of those who are required to service those societies which have not reproduced their own service providers? And I can tell you for free that even when we are sending those students back, the America is already facilitating to import nurses from third world countries, because COVID has devastated the whole care system in that country. Again, it takes us back to relook at our society and say, some of these boundaries that has been put there, they are now creating a situation where we should be looking not only at the class struggles, but I think our struggles is boundaries we are putting between people and natural resources. You are putting between people and the occupations. I think those are elements that are bouncing back. And in my sense, I think that COVID has told us we need to reevaluate our systems. And I think you could tell this very clearly. Those countries that have been going through political situations that are wanting, they have even tried to use this period of pandemic to advance their positions. And this still also brings us to say, we are not going to only look at the social, economic, but political, ecological scenario in order to fix what imagination of society we want. A society that is inclusive, a society in which everybody cares for the other. And I think I want to end finally by saying, this pandemic has clearly shown us that even issues of food security are not about having malls selling what we call the biodiversity of supermarkets. It's about causing people to be food sovereign in their own territories, because the limitations. If you have your slaughterhouse, Michael just put it in China and it's locked up, how do you get your foster foods? If you have your eggs expected from South Africa and Kenya, how do you get those eggs? Eggs expected from Brazil to Africa, how do you get it? And I think all these questions are coming to bear. If you are expecting your legumes, beans, peas from Africa to Asia to complement the Asian meal, how do you get them? So the issue of food security versus food sovereignty has bounced back in a big way. And the community and the social movements are back trying to say, we need a place on table to be part of this discourse. And I think COVID has basically brought us back to say, we need to go back on those tables, forget about the binary nature of creating these boundaries that are causing a lot of struggles. I want to end it at that.
Thank you very much, Odenda, for really bringing us up to speed with your comprehensive understanding of how global systems are working to actually undermine the capacity of people to work harmoniously with each other. And in fact, it makes me think that it's not just the highs trying to kick the students out because they don't really have classrooms, according to them, but also the fact that Trump, when he announced the H-1B visa would be restricted heavily, the panic that spread across India, for instance, because it shows that the nature of globalization has made us much more vulnerable to such shock to us. So yes, what does resilience mean in this situation and how do we move forward? I'll request you to hold on because also looking at the time, I'd like to the other speakers come in. So on that note, I will invite Roberto Bissio from Uruguay to speak. He had spoken on how the market, the state and society was evolving to kind of control people's capacities to survive this horrible times. And in fact, interestingly, he spoke to us when he gave a talk that just before the pandemic was discovered in China, there was a report from, if I'm not mistaken, WHO, which said, and I quote, "There is a very real threat of a rapidly moving, highly lethal pandemic of a respiratory pathogen, killing 50 to 80 million people and wiping out nearly 5% of the world's economy. A global pandemic on that scale would be catastrophic, creating widespread havoc, instability, and insecurity." This was from 2019, and Roberto had used that to also highlight how 85% of the global organizations working in health are headquartered in Europe and North America. And so they're basically to highlight how, for instance, the systems of, the economic and political systems that shape global health organizations obviously may also have a lot to do with how Europe and North America think of the world. So in a sense, also the fact that colonization is steeped, they're steeped in the colonial tradition there. But he also highlighted how, for instance, wherever governments have spent a percentage of their total spending quite heavily on health, and these are not the rich countries. He quoted Cuba, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Jamaica. COVID did not spread at all. In fact, it kind of picked up and died out very quickly. It flattened very quickly. Whereas the global, G8 and Davos and others are actually promoting, despite this very stark evidence showing how countries which spend very little in terms of GDP are suffering the worst. Take for India, India as an example, less than 1 or less than 1% of its GDP goes into health. Yet the argument that is being made is private sector expenditure is the way to go. And he went on to say that, and I quote, "Actually, at the moment, some people are saying the pandemic is a blessing for people are trying to destroy, for the people that are trying to destroy social security, because you'll get rid of all the pensions. You won't have to pay them." But actually, this is not what is happening in Latin America, as the countries that have a lot of pensions are at the same time the countries that have a better health system because they have been able to stand up to the lobbies. So here, in that sense, Roberto gave us an idea of the type of deep state that operates to keep this world divided. And he also showed us some, in graphic, through his amazing illustrations, how this deep state is trying to keep the world divided. So on that note, Roberto, please come in and share your thoughts.
Thank you. Actually, it is an important point to realize that the threat of such a pandemic had been forecasted, had been envisaged, and people were aware of that. And people were so much aware of that that even the Gates Foundation funded the creation of a preparedness index. Okay, since such a terrible pandemic is coming, are countries prepared or not? And that preparedness index, where hundreds of researchers participated from dozens of institutions from different countries, basically came out with the conclusion that the best prepared country in the world to face a pandemic was the United States. Second best prepared country in the world, United Kingdom. And immediately after, Western Europe, Germany, France, and so on. And the African countries were at the very bottom, and China, Iran, India, like in rank number 100 of 200 countries or so. Which is exactly the opposite of what we see actually happen. The countries that were ranked as best prepared are those that have failed the most to protect their own population. And maybe such kind of an index is part of the problem, because when the pandemic started in China, a lot of people thought, oh, that's a problem of the Chinese. It's because you see it in the index, they are not really well prepared. We don't have to worry. We are not going to be affected. And so they delayed preparation and so on. Whereas many middle-income countries were really scared, and they started preparation quite early. In my own country, in Uruguay, the health minister went to the university and started to study COVID 2 weeks before there was actually one case appearing. So the point here, and it's related to what has been said before, there is a correlation between that preparedness or supposed preparedness and GDP, per capita GDP, income of a country, and per capita GDP spending on health. And the logic, in a way, was those who spend more on health are going to be better off. What happens in reality is that that doesn't stand true, and it does not correlate. And the correlation that I was explaining happens in Latin America. Later, after my talk, I came to some studies that are publishing in more detail and about the whole of the world, that what correlates is private expenditure on health means more deaths from COVID. The more private expenses you have on health, the more people die of COVID. And why is that? Because more private expenses on health means less government expenditure on health, means less public health, means actually less preparedness, because of what has been said already. Private expense on health is individually oriented, is luxury oriented, because it's the people with a lot of money that can spend their own pocket money on health, and they spend on say accessory or luxury aspects of health, and not the basic public health, vaccination, prevention, hospital beds, nursing, and so on for all, which is what you need in case of a pandemic. And so you have that inverse correlation, and a very clear correlation where a high percentage of the spending in health is from the government, even when the actual money spent is much lower. You know, if you take Jamaica, which is a much poorer country than Brazil, is doing much better than Brazil with $300 a year per capita of expenses, which are mainly government expenses, than Brazil with around $1,000 per capita a year of expenses, which are mainly private expenses on health, and where the situation is a disaster. Now, this probably leads us to everything that is wrong with taking GDP, not just as a measure, but as a goal. All our politicians, they measure their success by economic growth, by GDP, instead of looking at many other factors. And in these days and in these reflections, I've come several times to a quote by Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, famous anthropologist of the 20th century. And Margaret Mead was once asked, what is the first trace of human civilization? The demand was probably about a building or an arrowhead or some clay pot or something, that material that could show where the oldest trace of civilization was. And what she pointed out was to a healed femur, a bone of a human remain of 15,000 years ago that had broken and was healed and was later found out in some dig. And she was saying an animal with a broken leg dies because before the bone can heal, it will starve from lack of food, lack of water that cannot access, or just a victim of the predators. A healed femur bone indicates that somebody cared for that person, that somebody assisted, healed, fed, protected during several weeks that it took the bone to heal. And that is the first material evidence of human civilization. Now, I think this is very important because if it is care what defines civilization itself, and this is a truth that now in these times of COVID is much more better understood, because what is really essential in all societies is care, is health care and the healthcare providers, but it's care, as was said, for the elderly, for the young, for the people with disabilities, care which is badly paid, frequently unpaid, mainly done by women, of course, all around, across the world, and so on, but which is essential to keep civilization alive and going. And I think that while, you know, a lot of people are going around making fortunes out of the COVID, building empires like Amazon because of the failure of traditional retail being substituted by IT-driven systems and so on. While this is happening, while the trend to financialization and so on also goes on, and while we are having in many countries a socialism for the rich with massive subsidies and granting money and so on to corporations so that they don't collapse, we are going to need, and people are realizing that more and more, a little bit more of socialism for the poor, a little bit more of revaluing care as an essential value in societies, of measuring it in a way that says a society that cares is a better place to be than a society that puts all its value on money and private interest and takes that as the measure of success. And we are still in the middle of the pandemic. We still don't know how deep, how far it's going to impact. We do know that after the pandemic, the crisis of the system in terms of impoverishment, joblessness, hunger around the world is going to be dire. It's going to be worse than anything any living human being has experienced. How to face that crisis will really become the question. And the usual austerity, cut the deficit, and so on recipes that are being repeated will certainly not work. And you have to rebuild based in solidarity and based in care. And hopefully that lesson is being learned, and the people in the streets, the people that are back in the streets in many parts of the world, from Chile to Lebanon to places where they had been in the streets before the pandemic, are clearly going to push for that.
Thank you, Roberto. It reminds me of what happened in Bangalore in the late 1890s when there was the bubonic plague which went across. And the city was, of course, tiny compared to what it is now. But up to 20 or 30% of people died. And we have a temple not too far from our office, which is called Plague Amma, which is a reverent way of addressing, and the goddess Plague is celebrated there even now. And people go and pray there and ask her to protect them from the next pandemic. Quite obviously, the temple has become very famous now. But the interesting point is the response of the then Maharaja was to actually invest in ensuring that there is public health. Some of the best hospitals, in fact, last week when Manju spoke, she said the Maharaja built one of the finest hospitals in India at that time. And the manner in which the hospital was built even today is able to take the capacity of a population which is like 100 times more now. So yes, I mean, it shows that 100 years ago when we were still a colonized country, but there were pockets in India where we did right. And Bangalore actually thrived because of the type of planning which was done in those times. Obviously, they didn't think it was a megapolis that they were preparing for. But yes, I mean, what you say rings a lot of bell in practical terms for us as well. I mean, both faith and reason came together in India at least. Thank you. Bhargavi, over to you.
Thanks, Leo. I would now like Jason and Aaron to come on board because they actually had a conversation. And Aaron spoke about race, prejudice, and justice, how citizens can utilize advocacy to address systemic oppression. Aaron brought in some very important points. For example, he acknowledged the public education system and how the public education system is not just funded by the state, but also with the sales revenue that builds it. And he acknowledges that going to get such education is also a way in which people can begin to understand the different systems of oppression. And he said something very important. He said, if your education allows you to understand history and its true context, then you understand where things are. But if that education falls short, then you are unable to understand where things really play out. So within America, we constantly see that concept of systemic racism, institutional racism, and systems of oppression, and that the systems that are in place really maintain racial inequality and literally every aspect of life. There was a lot more, but due to constraints of time, I will just ask Aaron to respond and share some of his more recent thoughts because he's been very active out there.
Sure, and hello to everyone that's on the call. I'm really honored to be a part of this. I want to thank you, Bhargavi, and you, Leo, for organizing us. I have a liberal arts training and background, so listening to all of the discussions, I'm now able to see what you saw, which was the interconnectedness of all of our different talks about justice and how that shows up in financial systems in various countries throughout various movements. So I'm very honored to be here. In my work, I study the United States education system and seek to mobilize citizens, whether they are people of faith or people of conscience, to address the inequities that we see in America in our K through 12 public education system. We have a system of 55 million young people, and we have a current administration that seeks to constantly redirect billions of dollars in federal funding away from the 90% of students who attend public schools to the tune of 50 million people, and redirect those funds towards private schools, which the high low end of the numbers between 5 to 5.6 million. Just recently, there was a rule passed by the Secretary of Education that would allow $13 billion in federal funding that, again, was supposed to largely go towards public schools, particularly Title I schools, which in America, these are schools that educate young people or fund young people that fall into economic and racial categories of poverty. That money was, again, redirected towards giving a larger share towards private schools. And this inequity feels like it's very blatant. It's a clear policy direction of this administration. And one of the concerns has been that given COVID and a number of other issues happening, that there's a constant onslaught of this type of work, which requires a constant activity from advocates and activists to speak against it. The connection to systems of oppression can't be overlooked because in America, particularly in our education system, those who are of lower income tend to have a high correlation with racial background, and those of higher income tend to have a higher correlation with the ability to attend private schools and receive their education. So what COVID has done on a number of levels it has given us the opportunity to look at these inequities closely and make a decision as a country of if we are going to address the inequities or not. The Reverend William Barber, who is a minister who has picked up the mantle of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And pushed for a movement called the Poor People's Campaign, often points out the interconnection between race and poverty in America. He's made an excellent point that I think COVID has made very clear, which is we cannot, as a country, go back to what was normal. You will often hear in the news and in the media people who are concerned about COVID and people who say very basic things, such as they want to return back to normal. They want to be able to socialize with their friends and go out to movies and not have to think about the repercussions or the impact on others. Underlying that thought is a part of the systemic oppression that exists. Here in America, we have a struggle right now with some of my colleagues have mentioned the spikes in COVID. One of the biggest issues of those spikes have been a desire of some of our citizens not to wear masks. And one of the things that came clear with COVID was that it is definitely impacting communities of color at a higher rate than white communities, and specifically people with comorbidities and those of color, especially in my community and the African American community. So that literally wearing a mask can help save lives, help prevent the spread of the virus, and literally social distancing or staying home for a longer period of time would assist with the spikes that we're seeing. And oftentimes we find people literally waging counter protests or anti-protests against government when they've sought to put these restrictions in place that benefit a greater good. And I think this is a larger reflection, again, of this systemic oppression that's seen. So, tying that to, I believe, what Mr. Goldman was talking about in terms of Black Lives Matter, this time in America, which actually fits within our history, there's something about summertime in America that really, with the change of weather and the impact of a racial incident that may not have had the same impact before, there's something about summer where there's a confrontation of those things. So right now, protests are raging. The Black Lives Matter movement was highlighted by the New York Times as being one of the largest social justice movements, not only in America, but in the world, to the tune of 15 to 26 million people leaving their homes through a global pandemic to protest what they're seeing as inequity. And I think that's what's happening right now. People are recognizing the inequities that have become normalized in America, the inequities in education, the inequities in the policing system, that in state budgets, we can see more money spent on policing than we do in education. So those following, one of the policy points that have been pushed has been a movement to defund the police. Minneapolis has gone further from that, and the city council did a very what's considered an aggressive or revolutionary move, but again, in a system that's attempting to correct itself. You can look at it from that perspective as well. But what the Minneapolis City Council voted to do was dismantle the police and to put in a completely new system, which is literally the textbook definition of revolution, right? The textbook definition of revolution is essentially, replacing a system, particularly a system that is not functioning well or functioning to the benefit of the largest amount of its citizenry. So we're seeing across the country that there's been impact from protest, that the protest has gotten extreme impact, and that as a country, we are really having to reconcile with this idea of normalcy, the normalcy that we accepted of oppression in America, again, through multiple systems. One of our colleagues mentioned the impact on visas for students. Schools right now not only are suing the federal government, but schools are being asked to actually hold in-person sessions that while the lawsuits are happening to be and standing with the law to allow students, particularly international students, to have classes in person in order to circumvent the law, or at least to follow it, even against the health and safety, not only of those students, but also professors. So something exciting is happening. I mentioned history, and I referenced that because in 1919, it was called the Red Summer. In the United States, nearly 25 riots took place across the country in cities that we see some of the same protests happening now, in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and other cities. And I think it behooves America right now to really dig in and to really make sure that it's not only paying attention to its past, but that it's really using this moment that the movements have created. Movements create moments. And this is a moment where America has to really face the systemic oppression that's been in place for so long and make the determination if it's going to take systemic steps, prolonged systemic steps to begin to dismantle those systems of oppression. You couple that with a political race that's happening for 2020 between Donald Trump and the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, and you start to see some of the reasons why our politics aren't matching, why the federal government has not taken a much stronger stance as it should. We just had one of the most confusing press conferences that I've seen in my lifetime of the Vice President Pence attempting to explain that the CDC is noting the spiking of COVID and recommending that people go back and cities go back to phase 1, which is complete shutdown, and then giving contradictory information to the American public, saying that it's safe for children to go back to school and that people should go back. So we're dealing with these contradictions. But if we follow the dollar, if we pay attention to politics and we pay attention to history, those of us that are advocates, those of us that are activists can see the line and again use this moment to really push for movement and change.
Thank you, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
In the same conversation, Jason said something very powerful, and I have been thinking about it since that day. And he said, I just wanted to point out is that too often there is an assumption that there already exists a community. I want to take a leaf out of the work inspired by Dr. Ambedkar in India. And there is work that suggests that society doesn't just magically drop from heaven, right? Society is built through fraternal relations. Unless I recognize you as a brother, or maybe not a brother, merely as human, just like me, there can't be a community. So Jason, that was a very powerful thing. And I've been thinking about it because working with local communities, impacted communities, we just, take community for granted. So it'll be great if you can reflect on that.
Right. So thank you, Bhargavi, for actually zooming in on that. But thank you also for inviting me. Thank you, Leo, and thanks to everyone who's spoken thus far and who's here. I've really picked up quite a number of things, um, and which I'd like to reflect on. But maybe since Bhargavi has already directed my attention to this, I want to speak about this idea of society. I mean, once again, if it is a powerful idea, I claim no responsibility. This is entirely to Dr. Ambedkar and persons who reflect more actively on his work. But I thought it's something that we need to reflect on. Too often in social science work, we use the word society, just thrown around, society. And I think this might also link back to, I think, what Michael Goldman said. What is this? When we talk about communities, we're not talking about poor people working with poor people, rich people working with rich people. That's really not community. Really, society is about us recognizing ourselves in other people. And then saying, how can I work to the benefit of that person, because it eventually works back to me. Not in so utilitarian a manner, obviously. I've been actually, this whole COVID thing has just made me a little upset, because you realize, I was at a gathering recently where people were just taking their masks off, right? And I was stunned, because, I mean, I was sitting with them. I maintained my mask throughout. So this was a reactionary group, right? And so clearly they were demonstrating their disdain for the norms of the rest of the world, their disdain to the state. And I mean, I have to point out that this was in a Catholic context, right? And these are persons who claim to be Catholic. And I was like, this is so not on. It's not about you. Yeah, it is about how you might impact, your actions might impact on someone else. And if you're doing this in a Catholic context where you're claiming to represent Catholic interests and the best of Catholicism, this is really not on. So really, I mean, this whole pandemic has demonstrated how broken society is, if at all it exists at all. And I think we really need to actively give more thought. I'm so glad at least Bhargavi is thinking about it. That society just we shouldn't take it for granted. Society is something we need to commit to at every moment. So I'll just stop there. I just want to make one last point, which is that so many of us thus far has referred to the state not being able to cope. I don't think that is the case. I think the state is coping just fine. Yeah, the state is doing very well. The state is using the pandemic to its advantage, or at least the elites that control the state. This is the case in the US. This is the case in India. This is the case in Brazil. The state is doing just fine. Thank you very much. What's not doing very well are the peoples who the state has been set up for. And once again, I think what has to be questioned at the end of the pandemic is the social contract. Is the social contract being fulfilled by the state? And clearly it isn't. And we need to think more actively of how we're going to deal with this scenario. Because so much of what, I mean, even what Aaron has been speaking about, providing of education, right, by the state. This is a great idea. I'm not against it, and it needs to be done. But what happens when you don't do this, right? We need to now, and this is not going to, increasingly, my suspicion is that this is not going to happen. We are in the new normal, right? There's no going back, but this moment is going to define the new normal. And we need to now start thinking, how do we respond to this? Because so many of us are operating from some kind of liberal perspective. And that liberal perspective, I think, is out of the window, right? This is a final blow, I think, to the liberal order. And we need to start now actively rethinking how we're going to move forward. And thinking about society and what it means and how to make it may not be a bad place to start. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Over to Leo.
Thanks, Bhargavi. Again, we are coming back to the concept which is cross-cutting, and I think that's the perfect time for Peter Boyle to come in, who made a case for eco-socialism. And when Roberto said about society that cares is a better place to be, and Jason just alluded to what kind of society we must actually now start thinking of constructing. Peter had explained how eco-socialism could be a way out. And he had made three major points. One is how we can think of energy systems which would move away from fossil fuel. He also talked about actually actively imagining a zero waste society. And most importantly, he talked about responsibility and how to ensure that that responsibility is embedded in every aspect, technologically, programmatically, in decisions and so on. And in that sense, he had referred to the kind of societies which were, I mean, if I may use that term, experiences from Cuba, experiences from the Kurdish region, are now those people are actually reimagining their, governments and reimagining their societies. And I've actually tried to make decentralized confederalist democracy work. So in that sense, he had made a case for eco-socialism in which he had said that the dominant economic paradigm that we are all living through now, the basic thing about that, he said, and I quote, is that financial capital in its very essence wants to make people pay back. It is all based on debt. The whole thing is a house of cards based on debt. And therefore, it basically is about creating vulnerabilities and high risks for those who have to be indebted. So on that note, Peter, I invite you to speak and help us try and take eco-socialism forward. Peter, you have to unmute.
Thanks for inviting me to take part in this conversation. I'm a latecomer to this series, but listening to everyone's contribution, I can see 100 points that we could talk about. Obviously, all the things that we're involved in are intersecting in a big way. But I guess what I wanted to focus on was a central point, which I tried to make. Taking as my lead a very young person, and that is Greta Thunberg, when she observed two things, and that is one, that we're hitting a situation where we are going into a sustained global crisis, multiple level crisis, but in essence, it's focused around the clash between capitalism and our sustainability, our ability to actually live together with nature, with the planet. And secondly, she made the point, which I think is actually very interesting. And the more I listen to other people, it makes me feel like it's a profound point. That if there's one thing we should learn from this COVID pandemic that we're going through, is we have to learn about crisis and learn about facing up to crisis and learn about the possibilities, the new possibilities that crisis might open for us. And in specifically addressing the theme of this series, I think it opens up the possibilities for various imaginings of better worlds, alternatives, to move from, its beginnings as ideas generated by discussions like this and many other discussions and deep thinking, into something more tangible, into practical solutions that are embraced by the mass of society, not as, this is an important idea or a convincing idea or morally convincing idea or an intellectually convincing idea, but simply presented as a practical solution. So, so imaginings then gets transformed into practical solutions to intractable problems that we are facing as a society, and I mean as a global society. And in this process, I think for people who have been, I guess, involved for a long time in articulating these imaginings, we have to recognize two things. That in this creative process that is part and parcel of the crisis that we are rolling into, there's going to be a lot of fleshing out. So our sketchy ideas, our rather general and abstract ideas get fleshed out in a very real and concrete way as societies actually grapple with intractable problems. Secondly, there's going to be a lot of, if you like, mass editing of our imaginings. And I think we have to be open to these things. We have to embrace them. If we go in with our fine, great utopias or whatever, and expect history to then follow the script, I think it won't work. And I think that we'll be wasting our energy. We'll be bashing our head against a brick wall. So I think out of that, I went on to a discussion of discussing the ideas of eco-socialism, not arising out of some ideological stance, but arising, as Leo said, of posing practical solutions to problems as they confront society. So, I mean, that was a general framework. What I wanted to share with you, actually, it's an interesting recent experience that I've been involved in my country here, which is the last 10 days, we've seen basically the second wave of the pandemic. And now, Australia is a country which actually got on top of the pandemic quite successfully on a world scale. We had actually, after hesitation, after our governments were tempted a little bit by following Trump, and Boris Johnson opted to go for suppression. And because of its isolation, its relative isolation from the rest of the world, it was a viable thing. And we actually had, after a period of lockdown that went for about 6 weeks, we had got the numbers of new cases down to around 10 to 12 a day. That's pretty amazing. You might think we didn't have a problem anymore. But when you have a second wave, the rapidity at which it goes from single digits to double digits to triple digits is actually quite astounding. And it's a reminder that when we talk about crisis, I think we are talking about not just a crisis where, the system can deal with, because in a certain way, I think we've all lived through our entire lives within capitalism, and we experience capitalist economic crisis, which has got two faces. Obviously, there's a bit of disruption here and there, but it actually, in a way, it's part of the system. It's a regenerating aspect of capitalism, and partly it's capitalism's strength is that it keeps surviving through a self-generated process of, repeated crisis, and it makes it invincible. But the way that this crisis that is being presented in its current face of the pandemic, but I think that's just one face of a bigger clash between capitalism and nature, is a different sort of crisis. I think it's a crisis that doesn't necessarily offer the kind of automatic bounce back to more GDP growth in the future. And you can see the fear in the eyes of our rulers. You can see the fear in the eyes of the huge corporations who are presuming that they'll be able to carry on business. Because right now, we had the situation where they thought, no, we had already opened up the economy. We had made people go back to work. We had opened the schools, everything else. And when the numbers started to go up again, they looked and said, It's very interesting. It seems to be happening among the lowest sector of the working class. In fact, it seems to be happening with largely migrant workers, you know, recent migrant workers who are doing the shittiest jobs and the most casualized jobs. They were the lowest part of society. And they thought, well, look, we'll contain it. So in the last 10 days, we went through this strange process. First of all, they picked out 10 postcodes, and they were all working class suburbs in one city where the bounce back was happening. And they put them into lockdown, into a relatively light lockdown. And then they noticed that there were a number of cases coming in a number of public housing estates. And these are, you know, they're these high-rise estates, very, very crowded, no ventilation, very poorly maintained. And some of the poorest sections of society live there. And in these particular estates, 9 large buildings with 3,000 people, they thought that they would do their complete sealing off of the bounce back of the virus. So without notice, one night, they sent down 500 police to block these towers off. And they're tower buildings, so you can only get out of a couple of entrances. They send the police in, they put in 1 policeman for every 6 residents in those buildings. So it was like war. And many of these people were people who had come from Somalia, they had come from the Middle East, they had come from war-torn countries. They were already traumatized, and this was a very traumatic experience. But it was a total fiasco. People were upset. There were struggles going on the entrances. They couldn't feed these people. They couldn't deal with all the practical problems that came up. And in this process, a huge discussion broke out in society that involved questions of class, involved questions of race, and it involved questions of power, because the role of the state, the police, it was like Black Lives Matter meets COVID-19 crisis. And it was explosive. 3 days, we started to see an amazing thing. The residents started to organize themselves. Their friends outside started to organize food and supplies. There were actually battles, and there was one particular battle with the police to get food to the residents that was captured by somebody's cell phone. And about 8 police jumped on this African young man who was trying to deliver food. And he was shouting out, "I can't breathe." Those 3 words, "I can't breathe." And the resonance politically, it went viral. And you know, 3 days later, they had to retreat, basically. Now the whole town, the city, it's Melbourne, it's the 2nd biggest city in Australia. The whole city has gone into lockdown because they realized they couldn't contain it within 1 or 2 suburbs. Now, to me, that showed quite a lot of things. It showed that, I mean, maybe it's different in different places. I have a sense here that this is not a very containable sort of crisis. I think it is shaking the system in many different ways. And I think it intersects with other processes, other crises, other political crises, and other big political discussions, particularly among young people. Because I do see this. I mean, I'm in my 60s, I'm 67 actually, and I can see a layer of people from their late teens to about 30 who are going through a kind of a quite radical rethinking about how does society operate, what are our values, etc. And I can see this process intersecting with the crisis, or actually I think it's generated by the crisis. And I think that a lot of hope for future change comes from that. But okay, to finish off with this, I want to say, I have a sense of great optimism in the creative potential of these new layers of people who are moving into a questioning and an active questioning of society. And I feel like for people who have been involved in the process of thinking about change and social change, etc., and environmental change, we have to embrace them, and we have to be prepared for them to write the details, you know, of how we get there, for them to edit our imaginings in a concrete, effective, and creative way. I hope that it's not too abstract, but I just kept thinking about these things as I heard you talking.
I mean, we never knew this had happened in Melbourne. I mean, news itself is being gated nowadays. So thanks for sharing that. Thank you, Peter. Bhargavi, we are, of course, gone beyond our scheduled time. We hope to wrap up in 15 minutes. But yes, we still have one more speaker. So Bhargavi, please.
Yeah. So to discuss what Manju Reddy shared with us, she shared something very interesting, again, something that, left us last weekend thinking about. So she spoke about the concept of learned helplessness. So she said that when humans or animals begin to understand or believe that they have no control over what happens, they begin to think, feel, act as if they are helpless. And the next point is crucial. And she said, I want you to take home this message. This is not an innate trait. No one is born believing that they have no control. It is a learned behavior. Hence, it's called learned helplessness. And she, went on to discuss what happened in India, especially with the migrant workers having to walk back home. And she drew examples of how learned helplessness worked out there. And then she went on to conclude her talk with, she said, in order to achieve some of these utopian ideals, equity, inclusion, liberation, justice, solidarity, resilience, and dependency, we need every community, every village, every district. We need dream makers, we need thinkers, we need to bridge builders, and we need storytellers and caregivers. And she said we need visionaries. We need to focus on nurturing this talent at every level. And she said that this is where I see COVID-19 offering this possibility to bring about this new change. So yes, Manju, if you can reflect from last week and share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Bhargavi, for that, highlight. And thank you all again for including me in this wonderful panel. Learned helplessness, I was hoping that, it sows a seed in everybody to think differently about past pandemic, post-pandemic as we speak. I think it's on everybody's mind. How do we go about after we get through this crisis? And again, going back to normal, which was, before COVID-19, is not something that we should envision going forward. And I, personally, if this has not been talked about, and the reason why I made those comments are, if you look at any community, any village, any district, in any country, those who had emotional resilience, emotional agility at the leadership level, governance level, they fared better. And I'm going to say that it so happened that it happened with some of the women, and gender became an issue where, we said, oh, some of these countries have women leaders and they did better. But I take it a step further and say that those who were able to, address their own cognitive dissonance, through their leadership style. And if you notice that those whose actions and their words aligned, and those who showed the resilience and the equanimity and calmness during this crisis, they actually fared better. And these are also the same societies that actually bring people together. They spoke with the public health team. The health minister, did their own homework, and they brought all of these different, categories of people, people with a multidisciplinary perspective, to come and weigh in on this issue. And it is more than ever necessary, and going forward we need to think that way. And I think every community has those kind of dream makers, connectors, builders, creators. We need to bring them and empower them. And I think the reason I call India Fabergé is because it has had that history, and we need to go back to those roots and bring back all those wonderful things that we had and focus on those and build from there.
Thank you, Manju. So, Leo, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Manju. Again, I think that was a very, very powerful and hopeful note that you have shared with us, and we have gone 20 minutes beyond our time. So I really don't have much of a choice in terms of what we can do, but I can possibly invite Sheila, because she inaugurated the series. If you can kindly share some thoughts, I mean, having listened to all of these amazing insights from across the world, we can then perhaps wrap it up, because I know we have taken a lot of your time. Some of you have woken up at 4 in the morning. So thank you. Some of you are staying back at midnight. So it's been an amazing experience listening to all of you from across the world. And as I said before, we are going to edit these talks and put it together as a volume very soon and share it. Already I have shared it with a local group of bureaucrats who suddenly realized that local organizations such as ward committees do matter in tackling a pandemic, and it's not just chief ministers and prime ministers who should deal with it. And I've invited them to sort of, I don't know if they're there, but several of them are actually watching this on Facebook. So yes, on that note, I invite Sheila to please share some final thoughts, and then I'll ask anyone else if they want to share some final thoughts, but very, very briefly. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. You do have a way of putting people on the spot, but
no, but I saw that you had a coffee or two already, so.
Anyway, well, I mean, what to add to this wonderful panorama of experiences and reflections that we've had from, as you say, all around the world. I mean, I think that everybody's spoken about the importance of local energies that they have been either privileged to observe or fortunate enough to be able to engender in their own communities. And I think we're all taking heart from each other's experiences. I mean, it is odd in a way to read the headlines that we read every day in our semi-locked down conditions, and then be in this community where really everybody has expressed optimism in spite of the huge structural problems and difficulties that that all of us confront. So I think that I guess I'll just say that this is a moment, I mean, many people have talked about redefinitions of things, and I think that the whole idea of democracy, I mean, that is who rules, who the people are, and what by the people, of the people, for the people, those sort of simple prepositional phrases mean. That is on the line at the moment. And I think that there are at least 3 kinds of conversations going on that I would love to see continued by members of this group and across the communities whom we represent and reach. So one is a set of questions about the claimed technical competence of the rulers who have governed us from central positions. I mean, so I think that the whole sort of expert-driven competence model of government has been shown to be riddled with holes at all kinds of levels, and that more competence exists. I mean, this is something that STS scholars have been pointing out for a long time, that grassroots competence is something that needs to be set against the claims of expert competence. A second kind of debate is around questions of accountability and transparency. And I think, again, that there are a lot of moves that, I mean, for instance, Michael, you mentioned these murals that are being painted everywhere. And we've not paid enough attention as political analysts to these sort of symbolic ways of expressing participation, the kind of participation in the streets for which there is no political theory that sort of adequately confronts this. So I think the question of how and through what means people are accountable to their citizens is something around which I see a set of debates emerging. And then last but not least, is this a transformative moment? And many people have talked about climate change and about related, I mean, the idea of crisis, that we should be thinking about crisis in general. So what kind of society will we come out with after this is over? And I think people do sense, I mean, Naomi Klein has this book with the title, This Changes Everything. I'm not so optimistic that any this changes everything, but nevertheless, I think an imagination has been unlocked about this being, I mean, you know, people have been coining new terms for this. They've called it the anthropause because humanity has had to step back and pause for a certain number of days, weeks, months. And it's unlocked a kind of reflection on what societies come after. And I think that that is the revolutionary potential that we have to think about how to harness in, you know, not the kind of Jacobin frenzy of off with their heads, but in some more peaceful and nonviolent way. So this is, I think, a thing that many people have expressed hopefulness about, and I would love to go away thinking about how to crystallize that energy in productive, generative, and transformative ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. Michael, short comment?
No, I mean, how can I improve upon that? I mean, I think that this is sort of trite, but you know, the old story of Mahatma Gandhi being asked by a British journalist what he thought of Western civilization, and he laughed and he said, "That's a good idea," you know. Opens up the door to exactly what Sheila was talking about, is in this anthropause, but also this explosion of frustration and anger on the streets. You know, what is next? And I'm quite excited by what panelists are suggesting, but also what the world is suggesting, is that it is time for dramatic change. And I think the extent to which we can acknowledge the climate crisis, as well as the pandemic, as well as the crisis of economy, you know, that we should celebrate this anthropause and figure out, you know, the building blocks that we're all so familiar with, but we're only now being able to express, which is the, you know, the politics of love and care, which is a direct critique of, you know, the many forms of capitalism that people suffer under. And so I'm hopeful, and I hope that there's a way in which we can continue this conversation, as Sheila said, in our communities, but also collectively. So to put the burden back on Leo and Bhargavi. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That's a very light burden, actually. Odenda, please.
Yeah, I think mine, I'm grateful for all those who have managed this. I know we stayed safe up to this moment, and I know we are going to stay safer beyond this moment. And I think for me, this has just brought that every generation must apply itself to situations that they face. Our generation, especially when I look around, most of us are 60 plus or thereabout. It just means that we have lived to see things from the individualism that we have gone through. And we are now saying, is it really the way to go? Or do we bring in a sense of our commonness to face the common good in style? And I think all the ideas I've had is basically the reflection on the systems we live under. And I think we are not lesser thinkers than those who thought about the systems that have been made as if they are global faith. We just have to challenge them.
Thank you, Odenda. Roberto?
Well, I want to thank you and everybody for this amazing coming together of ideas, experiences, and imagination. Imagination about a future that we all know needs to be different than normal, and that business as usual is definitely not an answer. I think that rarely has there been in history a moment where really all around the world people are sharing a common experience, a common tragedy, and that what that can lead to is unpredictable, but we can face it with a sense of direction. And I think what comes out of this series is a sense of direction where we have to go into societies that value communities, that value care work, that value nature. And it's definitely a new kind of contract linking that together is necessary.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Peter, your turn.
Sheila, I was thinking when Naomi Klein put out This Changes Everything, she was being optimistic, and she should have said this should change everything. And I think that's the thing. It's that it's not just that you foretell a crisis, but you actually have to be in it. Well, the truth is that I think climate change, people have been in it, but the crisis has had to move from the periphery to the center. I think that's what's interesting in recent history. United States topping the list with the COVID disaster. That's a symptom of the crisis moving from the convenient periphery where capitalism has managed to largely keep it, coming into the center. And I think it is out of that, albeit scary experience, that the possibilities of transformation come from. It's both scary and it's exciting. I think that's the reality, but there's no avoiding it. Thanks everybody for discussion.
You see the graph now, the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy sandwiching Russia. So in terms of 1, 2, 3. So that's a frightening way to end up when you see what democracy has done and what communism has done. So I think we must actually move beyond this type of political constructs. Manju, your turn, and we close with that. You still there? Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Well, I'm going to take a little different perspective. India and even here in US, if you look at all the protests that happened around, across, majority of the protests about Black Lives Matter were dominated by young people. And I go back to India. India has youngest population. And I put a lot of my money into these young people whose aspirations and whose hierarchy of needs that they want to aspire having during their lifetime is so different from all these old structures. So they're going to bring in a lot of change because they're so connected. They know what's happening in the entire world. They're so globalized, even being in a small town in India. So I think they are the real hope for change, and they're going to lead. And that's where I think is the future. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Manju. And on that note, Jason said he has nothing to add. Thank you, Jason. AJ sent a message saying he has to go, so we don't see him on the screen. But I really, really appreciate all of you waking up early or staying back late and joining this confluence of imaginaries. Please trust us. Bhargavi and I will work really hard in bringing together an edited volume very soon. And I hope it will be useful to you all. And if such ideas can also keep multiplying, I'm sure that we can overthrow the current system quite quickly. So on that note, Bhargavi.
Yeah. On behalf of ESG, CFA, and the entire team that has been working every Friday to make sure everything is in place, I thank all of you for making this series a very successful one. We've had a very overwhelming response, not just on the Zoom, but also on Facebook, and people have been downloading these lectures and listening to it and writing to us. So it has been a wonderful 12 weeks, which passed so well with, despite all the anxiety we live in on a daily basis, the thoughts that you all shared help us sail through these very challenging times. So thanks again, and stay safe and take care.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Bhargavi.
This is the only way we can applaud each other. Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah,
Thank you again. Thank you very much.
thanks.
All right, thanks.